Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at the Second Great Awakening in our continuing study of the history of Christianity. I want to begin with Timothy Dwight. He was the grandson of Jonathan Edwards. Remember how Edwards had been elected to the presidency of the college in New Jersey, which became Princeton. Dwight becomes president of Yale College, and under his leadership, there's a revival at Yale. It includes such people as Lyman Beecher and Asael Nettleton, names that we'll see in the Second Great Awakening. The First Great Awakening had taken place from the 1730s to the 1750s, about 20-year period. The Second Great Awakening is going to be a much larger era from the 1790s, late 1790s, to at least the 1840s, if not a bit beyond. So it's going to take place over both a wider geographical border, but also a wider date range, a wider range on the calendar. The First Great Awakening focuses primarily in the colonies along the eastern seaboard because that's as far as the people had gone. Most of the land, if you got 100 miles away from the ocean, then you were out in the wilderness. The Second Great Awakening, that wilderness is now beginning to be occupied, and it's going to be felt throughout the entire new nation. Of course, by this time, there is a United States of America instead of just the colonies as we'd had in the First Great Awakening. Uh, some of the names involved in the First Great Awakening, we saw George Whitefield. Remember, he and John Wesley were the traveling evangelists. Wesley mostly in England. Whitefield went back and forth from England to the colonies. Jonathan Edwards, who was a pastor in the colonies, who actually teams up with George Whitefield, and they worked together for a time. And so those were some of the big names. In the Second Great Awakening, we're going to see names such as Charles Finney. He's probably the best known. Lyman Beecher, Peter Cartwright, one of my favorites. We're going to talk about his career and others as well. The First Great Awakening is largely Calvinistic in its orientation. Wesley was not, but Whitefield, Edwards, and others were. The Second Great Awakening is going to be largely Arminian. Again, that's going to be some of the effects of the Wesleyan Church, what we call the Methodist Church, that's now going to begin a big period of growth in the new nation. In the First Great Awakening, Jonathan Edwards had described revival as a byproduct of his preaching and teaching. Of course, there was Whitefield and Wesley who did excite people, but again, their excitement and Whitefield in particular was known for his very fiery preaching, very passionate delivery, very both eloquent and yet engaging, and yet it was about the preaching and the teaching in the Second Great Awakening. His grandson, Timothy Dwight, the grandson of Jonathan Edwards, is going to see revival as the calculated means to an end. That is, if you do these 3 or 4 or 5 steps, you will get revival. Reminds me of the Baptist church in which I attended when I was very young. They would have a revival every year, and sometimes I wondered, well, at the end of the year, they're going to have another revival. Does that mean everybody died in the interim so that they need to be revived again? But again, that's part of the calculated means. We're going to plan for a revival. It's going to take place when we do these steps. The First Great Awakening has a very strong doctrinal foundation. In the Second Great Awakening, I'm not saying there's no doctrine there, but it's going to emphasize emotion over reason in many, many cases. The Second Great Awakening is going to be characterized by camp meetings, where because it's moving away from the coast, away from the populated areas, it's not like you can find a town, you go into town and begin your revival there. Instead, they'll set up camp and they'll put the word out, and people will come from 20, 30, 50 miles away to gather, not just for a Sunday afternoon or something like that. It takes a long time to get there. And so they'll be there for a few days, maybe a week, where they'll camp out and have daily meetings all day into the night, and of course this becomes not just something used for religious purposes, but it becomes sort of a social affair as well. And because there's not a lot of social affairs out in the wilderness, a lot of people are going to attend because they're hungry for that social connection. It's very, in that sense, it's very what we could call man-centered. It's usually developed around a key individual who's going to gather the people. His name will become popular. So do these things, get involved in these things, turn your life around. It's not that they're not praying to God, but it's focused on you doing it. There's a rejection of predestination in that. Again, that's the sort of the doctrinal stance of most of the Second Great Awakening. A use of techniques. Here, we'll sing and then we'll stand up and we'll stomp and shout and sort of get the crowd worked up. And now they're ready to hear the sermon, and they'll hear the sermon and go back to more singing and maybe moving in circles. And if you want to see a modern counterpart to this, just go to the in the United States, the national conventions, the Democratic convention or the Republican convention. They are actually based after the camp meetings of the Second Great Awakening. Now, we're also going to see the growth of a number of new denominations, as well as the growth of some older ones. The Methodists had actually begun in the 1700s, but we're going to see them grow and develop in the Second Great Awakening in a way they had not in the First Great Awakening. We'll also begin to see female participation in these meetings, in worship services, and eventually we're going to see in a few denominations, especially some of the newer ones, the ones that are more, can I say it this way, on the fringes, we're going to see women being ordained in a few of those. Now that really hadn't been done previously. You can actually sort of notice the one or two women that are the very first to be ordained in this or that denomination. Things like the Quakers or the Methodists. In the more established ones, that's not going to happen for another 100 years or more. The temperance movement is going to be part of that female participation. What's the temperance movement? To temper the use of alcohol, sort of a down with alcohol. They looked at all of the evils that alcoholism had brought. And alcoholism, let me just say, has brought a lot of trouble to a lot of people. Some people just have no tolerance for that. I'm one of those that I just don't like the taste of it. I'm not sure if I have a tolerance or not because I haven't used it enough. I don't care for the taste, and so for me that's not an issue, but for others that is. Also, the women's suffrage movement, and that doesn't mean they're suffering, it means the right to vote. I guess that's linked with the right to be holding some sort of established position in ministry. But initially, it's going to be about women getting the right to vote. And that's going to be a big issue in the 1800s. And notice how that's going to link itself with some of the same people in the Second Great Awakening. Finally, the abolition of slavery, because slavery in the Americas and even in Europe early on was a real thing. It's not going to be until the 1830s that it will be outlawed in England, and it will be quite a bit later, after an American Civil War takes place, that you'll have the abolition of slavery in the United States of America. Now, some physical manifestations that are noteworthy in some of these camp meetings. The falling exercise, here's a description of it. Some fell suddenly as if struck by lightning, while others were seized with a universal tremor the moment before and fell shrieking. Piercing shrieks were uttered by many during the whole period of prostration, intermingled with groans, cries for mercy, and exclamations of glory, glory to God. Notice this is taking place, and it becomes like an exercise, a regular thing that people are doing. The jerking exercise, here's how that's described. Sometimes the head would be twitched right and left to a half round with such velocity that not a feature could be discovered, but the face appeared as much behind as before. If that sounds strange, it is today and was considered strange back then. And yet this is something that was taking place at these camp meetings. He goes on, in the quick progressive jerk, it would seem as if the person was transformed into some other species of creature. You say, what on earth is going on? And And the response was, well, this must be a heavenly manifestation. This is something that God is bringing on, God's Spirit is bringing upon them. The rolling exercise, it consisted in falling on the ground or floor and rolling over like a log very swiftly. Dust, mud, or water formed no barrier to the movement. Remember, some of these meetings were outdoors. Sometimes they'd have maybe a tent. Sometimes they wouldn't have that. And so whatever was there, that's what you were rolling, and it's just all over you. The running exercise, the dancing exercise, the barking exercise, where people would actually sound like they were barking like a dog. And these were all different things that they would do. Was it a manifestation of the Spirit, or were they trying to bring about the Spirit? Maybe a little bit of both. But these were considered sort of out there, and yet these things were taking place. Now, Asael Nettleton, he had studied at Yale after the revival there had already begun, and he's both Reformed and a Calvinist evangelist. So he's involved, but remember we said it's largely Arminian, but he's an exception to that rule, and he rejects those excesses of some of these other evangelists. Instead, he says these revivals were not temporary excitements, the ones that he's seen and in which he's involved, which like a tornado sweep through a community and leave desolations behind them, but they were like showers of rain, which refresh the dry and thirsty earth and cause it to bring forth, and notice he's quoting from the Bible, herbs meet for them by whom it is dressed. These fruits were permanent. In other words, he was seeing revival not that just was something that people had some weird experience and then went home and went right back to living the way they'd been living before, but rather where people saw real and lasting change. So you have both sorts of things taking place during the Second Great Awakening. He says that holy, humble, meek, modest, retiring form, sometimes called the spirit of prayer, has been dragged from the closet and so rudely handled by some of her professed friends that she has not only lost all her wonted loveliness, but is now stalking the streets in some places stark mad. He looks at some of the events that are going on, that are seen in the Second Great Awakening. He says they're crazy. But God's Spirit is not like that, and we got to get back to God's Spirit, the Spirit of prayer that we see in the Scriptures. Now, Francis Asbury had been discipled by John Wesley, and he had been in the Americas at a time when Wesley's anti-revolutionary stance, in the days of the Revolutionary War, the war against England with the American colonies seeking to be independent, Wesley had taken the stance that the colonies should not be doing that they should not go to war, that they should be loyal to the king in England, that they should not be fighting for independence. Now, if they just get it, that's fine. And that had meant that Wesleyan churches, the Methodist churches, became very unpopular in the colonies and what would become the United States of America. And so Asbury, a disciple of Wesley, had been sent, and he begins work now, and it really begins to bear fruit after the United States now becomes a nation. That's no longer an issue. Are they going to be under England or not? That's no longer an issue. And so he will begin the Methodist Episcopal Church of the United States. Now, notice the name. It's Methodist. In other words, it follows the various methods that Wesley is using. One of those methods, by the way, that now comes to the forefront is the idea of a Sunday school. What a great idea! Let's actually teach people, and they're teaching the various things, not just from the Bible, but also some basic things on that are going to help them hold on a job and sort of combining education with the meaning of the church. Um, but also notice it's the Methodist Episcopal Church. Now, that word Episcopal, remember that the Church of England was an Episcopal sort of church. That is, it had one person at the top, the King of England, and then under him was the Bishop of Canterbury, just like the Roman Catholic Church had a pope. And so that's what the word Episcopal means. So they're going to bring that same form of church government and bring it into the Methodist Church, because Wesley himself was all about the Church of England. He didn't feel that they should split and start a new church. But you're not going to have the Anglican Church in the United States of America. They actually fought a war to get away from England. And so now it's going to be called, instead of the Methodist Anglican Church, it's going to be called the Methodist Episcopal Church of the United States. And it will have bishops, and it will, that oversee a group of churches, and then priests and things like that. So it's going to borrow from the same form of church government, but we'll just do away with the England part. And Asbury becomes a traveling preacher. He is tireless. He regularly travels up to 6,000 miles per year. And remember, you didn't get on a plane or a car to do this. You went on horseback. And so he is going to begin this whole advent of what we think of as the circuit riding preacher. He's going to organize other preachers and train them to do the same thing. The circuit riding preacher then maybe would be assigned to an entire area where there might be 4 or 5, 10, 15, maybe more churches, and he will go from church to church, not in a single day, but over a period of weeks, if not months, traveling from one church to the next, so that he can get there, he can maybe preach a sermon or two, train up some people, perform weddings, funerals, if necessary. And they would come to these little churches. Sometimes these little churches would just have a handful of people in them, because they're from the surrounding farms and areas. And so this era of the circuit riding preachers is going to be, notice, there's a lot more churches than there are preachers, which is why you have a circuit riding preacher. You've got one preacher over a number of different churches. And this will spread the cause of the Methodist Church in particular, because you can be a Methodist with a lot less formalized training. You don't have to tell someone, well, go to college and then go to seminary, and after maybe 7 years or more, then you'll be ready for ministry. Much earlier you could have some very brief training and now be a circuit riding preacher. Now, one of the most famous circuit riding preachers of his day, his name is hardly known today, but Lorenzo Dow. It is said that there were more people that were named after him, more babies in the 1800 early 1800s named after him than almost any other name. It became for a time a very popular name, especially out in the West. He was one of these Methodist circuit riders, lived a very monastic lifestyle. He would wear the same clothes, didn't pack a bag to take clothes with him. He would just wear the same clothes until they became threadbare. And when they were so old and full of holes, then somebody would say, well, here, let me just give you some of my old clothes, which mean they didn't necessarily fit. And so he was not known for his great sense of style. He was also not known for his grooming. It was said, and the picture here would look otherwise, but it was said that a comb rarely went through his hair. It just grew out, and he looked sort of as an aberration. But this was part of his appeal. He was a fiery preacher. He would make use of these various excesses that we talked about. I remember one story that talks about how prior to him preaching, he had hired a young boy to set off, I don't know if it was a firecracker or some sort of small explosive device that would go off right as he reached a climactic point in his sermon. There would be a big bang, and it would be as though the Lord had said amen or something like that. He did not save money, and now he did a little bit in later years, but he rather lived almost like what we have with the mendicant. Remember how we saw the mendicant months, the begging months. He wouldn't actually beg, but he wouldn't save money, and And when he got to a place, if they would feed him, that would be fine. If they didn't, I imagine he would go hungry. He was rather thin from that. If they received him, then he would begin preaching. If they didn't receive him, he would begin preaching until they threw him out. And sometimes there would be crowds that would be throwing eggs and rotten fruit and things like that at him. Um, at one point, there was one town in Georgia that cast him out, and he said, because of that, I'm going to put a curse on this town. And don't remember the name of the town because it's not much of a town anymore. The town sort of withered up and died. People wondered, gee, did God do that? Or was it people maybe deciding, well, gee, maybe I shouldn't live here if there's been a curse put on the place? What is this? Was it a self-fulfilling prophecy, or was it a prophecy? I don't know. He had this very outlandish preaching style. He does get married, and he's one of the earliest husband and wife teams. His wife was in ministry with him, wrote a book, and his wife also wrote a book of her experiences, which those two books, especially his, became a bestseller in its day. So great amount of popularity, and yet today his name is barely known even among folks that study church history. Peter Cartwright, another of these Second Great Awakening preachers, also a Methodist preacher, has the nickname of God's Plowman. He describes in his book, and you can find his book on the internet, you can download it, fascinating reading. He talks about how he dealt with the rowdies, the people that would come into, remember, this is the sort of the Wild West. Now, it hasn't gone way west, but still the Wild West in that day was all the way up to the Mississippi and eventually beyond. And sometimes there would be those that came into his church, his service, his evangelistic service, to try to talk him down, or maybe they might come in a bit inebriated and want to get into a physical confrontation. Well, he says, it was part of my creed to love everybody, but to fear no one, and I did not permit myself to believe any man could whip me until it was tried. If someone was interrupting his worship service, he would call them out back, and they would have a physical confrontation, and he would sort of punch them out and then come back and continue his sermon. Charles Finney, the best name known in the Second Great Awakening, converted in 1821, so we're moving well into it by the time he is even converted. He begins as a Presbyterian evangelist until he finds out what the Presbyterians believe, and he says, well, I don't believe any of that. I don't know about any of that, but he rejects a number of foundational doctrines, including the justification via imputation. So he's a revivalist preacher in New York City. He is a fierce abolitionist. That is, he's speaking out very strongly against slavery, and rightfully so. But like I said, he denies justification via imputation. He says, no, you're justified by becoming a better person. Jesus saves you so that, what you do is you become a better person, and now you're declared righteous on that basis. I'm not even sure if he'd use the term declared righteous. In that, he reminds me actually of the Roman Catholic stance on justification. He asked the question, should the firemen sleep and let the whole city burn down? What would be thought of such firemen? And yet their guilt would not compare with the guilt of Christians who sleep while sinners around them are sinking stupid into the fires of hell. So he's a fiery evangelist calling people to repent, to turn to Jesus, to undergo a change so that they can be saved. He has what's called the anxious bench. I'm not sure if he originated this. He might have borrowed it from that which is already existing. But the idea here is that if you wanted people to pray for you, you came to the service and maybe there's something you want prayer for, come up here on the front and sit on this chair, this bench, and we'll all pray for you. You might come into the church and be seated at the anxious bench, and Finney, even though there's a crowd there, he'll preach right at you. You need to repent, you sinner. If you're not anxious before you sit there, you will once you've been sitting there a while under that preaching. The Revivals that Finney concocts are based on the techniques that we've seen already. He takes them, adapts them, brings them not just into the camp meetings, but now into the city proper. And so we will see this sort of immersive experience in the city as well as out in the camp meetings. He also makes use of various theatrical techniques. Now, Whitfield had done something similar in the First Great Awakening, not at the expense of theology, but still he had made use of some of these, and Finney does as well. Lighting and things like that. And we already mentioned about the revival techniques are seen in modern political party conventions. Think about the last time you watched on television. I don't usually, but the either the Democratic or Republican convention, there's a lot of stomping and shouting and people marching in lines and waving banners and all of these things. They're borrowing from Finney and others in the Second Great Awakening. Instead of telling sinners to use the means of grace, he says, and to pray for a new heart, I call on them to make themselves a new heart and press the duty of immediate surrender to God. This actually doesn't sound so much like Arminianism. This sounds actually more like Pelagianism. Remember how Augustine had argued with Pelagius back in the 400s A.D. Now, Lyman Beecher, another figure from this arena, he had attended Yale with Asael Nettleton. He's a Presbyterian minister, and he adopts Finney's new measures. That's what they're called by now. The new measures, sort of the techniques that are used. And he also speaks out against slavery. His daughter, Harriet Beecher Stowe, is going to write a novel that will be a game changer. We'll talk about this in a future class. But Uncle Tom's Cabin. And it's going to be a fictional novel looking at life from the vantage point through the eyes of two slaves. Now, the result of the Second Great Awakening, here's a number of results. First of all, we're going to see the Christianization of America. That doesn't mean that all of America becomes Christian, by no means. But what it does mean is that Christianity will soak into the culture so that people will become, if not actual Christians, they will become what I sometimes call cultural Christians. They will sort of connect. And if you ask them, what's your belief system? They're going to say, I'm a Christian, whether they realize what Christians believe or not. And certainly they're going to be immersed in the stories of the Bible. You can go to a lot of places in the world and I remember asking a student who had just come over from India one time, what do you think of Jesus Christ? And he says, who's he? Is that somebody that goes to school here? Here in this country, Jesus Christ and somebody who died on the cross and the idea of a virgin birth and some of the stories of the Old Testament, David and Goliath and Samson, those are bywords, even if somebody has never stepped into the church. A lot of people have, or at least had, heard those stories. That's becoming less and less these days. The democratization of American Christianity also becomes a thing. That is, people expect when they go to church that they are allowed to have their voice remember, this is sort of the result of the Congregationalism, which wasn't a universal idea in Christianity prior to this, but now becomes to be a thing. People taking a vote on within their church, not just the elders or bishops or leaders in the church making decisions, but the church itself, the church body now becoming more democratic in the way they see things. So you have Congregationalism, you have women in Christianity, women beginning to take on more and more roles, including being ordained to ministry. Now, that's not happening in every denomination in the 1800s, but it's beginning here, and it will eventually move over more and more through the mainline denominations to our present day. The decline of Calvinism among American Christians now begins to be felt. And so, whereas after the First Great Awakening, Christianity had largely had a Calvinistic faith, that's going to be less and less the case now after the Second Great Awakening. Henry Ward Beecher. He's the son of Lyman Beecher, a congregational minister and very popular preacher, preaching against the abolition of slavery. Notice the dates for him. So his life spans the American Civil War. He rejects his father's Calvinism, as so many had rejected the Calvinism of an earlier era. And he has an emphasis on God's love. He sees that as the antithesis of Calvinism. I'm not sure that we need to make that as an antithesis, but he does. He also faces and he engages in what's called theistic evolution. Remember, his lifespan also is going to span the publication, and we'll see this in a future class, of Darwin's Origin of the Species. And so he says, well, that's okay. If you believe in evolution, it could be that God used that to bring about his will. And we're supposed to read the early chapters of Genesis and to see all of that as describing sort of a gradual process that science tells us happened over millions of years. Now, there are some adultery scandals in his life. Remember, this is the 1800s. And so he has an affair with feminist Victoria Woodhull. And that sort of breaks out into the news, and he ends up stepping down from ministry because of that. Some other names, Elizabeth Tilton, and there's actually a lawsuit where Tilton's husband goes in and sues him for adultery. You could get sued for that sort of thing back then. I'm not sure if I think those laws have now changed in recent years. But so this isn't just rumored about. This actually makes the court and a big court case and a very messy scandal. He is finally excommunicated, not just from being a preacher, but actually from the church. Now, the growth of the Methodists. We've talked about the Methodists, but I want to focus on them for a bit. Remember, they were named for the method. It was probably used as a name of derision at first, but Wesley adopted it for themselves. They had a regular observance of the Lord's Supper, love feasts that would take place, periods of fasting, abstaining from amusements, the ministries of mercy, all good things, by the way. And yet they were very small, at least in the Americas, at the end of the American Revolution. They had grown in Britain because in Britain it was actually sort of connected with or part of the Anglican Church. But in the Americas, it had dwindled away because of Wesley's stance regarding revolution. So 1784, it was organized as an American denomination. Remember, Asbury was one of the key figures there. And they have Arminian theology, and that itinerant system, which we described under Asbury with the circuit riding preachers. And a formalization eventually took place and a desire to return to those earlier roots under of course, they're not going to call it Anglican anymore, but still to see the connection of the former Anglican Church. Now, notice you have the Methodist Episcopal Church, 1784. And that's going to lead to some other denominations. These are all before the American Civil War, which will lead to all sorts of new splits. But the Methodist New Connection, the Primitive Methodists, the Bible Christians, and notice they're not always calling themselves Methodists, and the African Methodist Protestant Church developed because there are going to be blacks that come to Christ, and they'll come into the church and they'll be told, well, you can come into the church, but you have to sit up in the balcony. You mean we can't come in here with the rest of the Christians and pray? No. And so they will actually form their own Methodist denomination. Now, also, before we close, let me just mention the Seneca Falls Women's Convention. What you're looking at here is a stamp commemorating it. The stamp is made in 1948, the convention itself back in 1848, and it's calling for equal rights, equal voting, and things like that. They're not getting it right then, but it's already sort of on the docket, if we can say that, and in people's minds, and it's being sought for by women, and it will eventually actually be seen where some of the denominations, not every denomination has, but some denominations will actually eventually ordain women. Finally, let me talk about the American Bible Society. Notice instituted in 1816, where Bibles begin to be printed en masse with the goal of having a Bible in the hands of every citizen throughout the country. And so these are going to be printed out and distributed that because the Second Great Awakening is supposed to be centered on the Bible. They're advocating that. They're not. I'm not sure how much they're doing it, but they're supposed to be Bible centered. In fact, there are some denominations that are saying we don't like denominations anymore. Let's just go back to the Bible. And even one of the Methodist denominations names themselves after the Bible. Let's go have that be our the source of our doctrine, our theology. Of course, you still have different people's interpretation of that, but that is leading to the growth and multiplication of a host of denominations in the Americas.